What if the Watchers were never meant to fall? The story most people know begins with rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and punishment. Angels descend, break the rules, and everything goes wrong. But when you slow down and read the oldest layers of the text, a different possibility flickers into view. Watchers as guardians, not rebels. Observers, not invaders. Assigned roles before the story turns dark. Somewhere between a few short lines in Genesis and centuries of later interpretation, intention may have shifted. Tonight is not about rewriting scripture or chasing hidden secrets. It is about asking how stories change as they are explained, expanded, and inherited. We are going back to the earliest texts, the historical setting that shaped them, and the questions ancient writers were actually trying to answer. Why watch the world at all? What happens when boundaries blur? And whether the fall was the starting point or the result, this is not a tale of aliens or lost technology. It is a closer look at responsibility, interpretation, and how easily purpose can turn into blame. If the Watchers were never meant to fall, what does that say about the story we have been telling ever since? Let's begin. Every few years, a claim resurfaces online dressed as revelation that the Watchers of the Bible were really the Anunnaki of ancient Sumer, renamed, misunderstood, and hidden in plain sight. It spreads fast because it feels simple. Two mysterious groups, two ancient worlds, one secret explanation, but history rarely works that way. When ancient people wrote about the divine, they left texts, languages, contexts, and intentions behind. Those are the only solid ground we have. Everything else is guesswork. This investigation begins with a rule that cuts through noise: texts first, theories second. The Watchers appear in ancient Jewish writings that grew during the Second Temple period, roughly between the 4th century before Christ and the 1st century after. They are not described as space travelers or advanced engineers. They are portrayed as heavenly beings whose role was to observe the world, who crossed a forbidden boundary, and whose actions brought disorder. The Anunnaki come from a very different world, the cities of ancient Sumer and Akkad, where people wrote on clay tablets in cuneiform script as early as the 3rd millennium before Christ. They were gods tied to cosmic authority, kingship, and in some periods the underworld. Already the timelines do not overlap neatly. Already the cultures speak different religious languages. Yet modern culture often ignores that gap. Online videos, forums, and memes compress thousands of years into a single blurred image. Names are swapped, motifs are merged, context disappears. The claim survives because it feels like a hidden truth, something institutions do not want discussed. But ancient writers were not hiding aliens. They were explaining suffering, violence, and moral collapse in ways that made sense within their world. The Watcher's story tries to answer a hard question. Why did the world become so violent that it deserved a flood? Why did humans know things that seemed dangerous too early? Why did power always seem to corrupt? The answer offered was not technology from the stars, but rebellion in the heavens. To test the Anunnaki connection honestly, we have to slow down and separate sources. We have to ask where each group appears, in which language, for what audience, and with what purpose. Similarity alone is not evidence. Ancient cultures reused ideas like divine councils, heavenly messengers, and cosmic judgment because they shared the same sky, not because they shared characters. This chapter sets the ground rules. No modern speculation without ancient support. No merging of myths without proof. If the Watchers and the Anunnaki are truly the same, the texts themselves must show it. If they do not, then the claim tells us more about modern fascination than ancient belief. History does not fear questions, it fears shortcuts. This matters because once we confuse categories, every myth becomes interchangeable and nothing means what it originally meant. Respecting sources is not skepticism, it is discipline. Without that discipline, ancient voices are drowned out by modern assumptions that feel exciting but explain very little. History deserves better than that approach. The Watchers are not a modern invention, and they are not a vague label borrowed from science fiction. They come from a specific body of ancient Jewish literature, written during the Second Temple period, most clearly preserved in the text known as First Enoch. This work circulated widely among Jewish communities between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after, long before internet theories existed. In these writings, the Watchers are described as heavenly beings assigned to observe the human world. Their name comes from an Aramaic term meaning those who are awake or alert. Their role was supervision, not creation, and certainly not technological instruction in a modern sense. The Watchers are presented as moral agents, bound by divine law. Their story is not about origin stars or lost civilizations. It is about failure. According to First Enoch, a group of these beings looked upon humanity and chose to cross a boundary that was not theirs to cross. They descended to earth, bound themselves by oath, and violated the order they were meant to uphold. This decision is central. The Watchers are defined less by what they are and more by what they did wrong. They teach humans practices that ancient authors viewed as corrupting, including improper weapon making, sorcery, manipulation of signs in the heavens, and the use of adornment to deceive. These acts are framed as moral corruption, not gifts of progress. The writers of Enoch were not praising knowledge. They were warning against it when removed from wisdom and restraint. The Watchers are also not rulers of the world. They answer to higher authority and are judged for their actions. Their punishment is severe and permanent. They are bound, imprisoned, and removed from influence. This matters because it shows how ancient Jews understood evil. It was not a rival power equal to God, but a rebellion that would be contained and judged. The Watchers fit into a world view shaped by covenant, law, and accountability. They exist within a hierarchy of heavenly beings that develops over time, later influencing ideas about angels and demons, but never fully matching them. When modern voices call the Watchers aliens, they strip away this context. They ignore the ethical language, the legal framing, and the theological purpose of the text. First Enoch was written to explain why the world was broken and why divine judgment made sense. The Watchers are a lens for human violence, injustice, and excess, projected onto the heavens to make sense of suffering on earth. They are not placeholders for astronauts or lost engineers. They are symbols of failed guardianship. Understanding who the Watchers are requires reading them as their authors intended, as heavenly observers who became transgressors, not visitors from another world. Their story reflects fear of uncontrolled knowledge and power without responsibility, themes common in ancient moral thought. When read carefully, the Watchers reveal ancient concerns about order, obedience, and the cost of crossing limits meant to protect both heaven and earth together. The Watchers enter the story not as a standalone myth, but as an explanation layered onto one of the strangest and shortest passages in the Hebrew Bible. Genesis chapter 6 contains only a few lines, yet those lines caused centuries of debate. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, took wives for themselves, and that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Then it moves on. No names, no details, no explanation of who these sons of God were, or why their actions mattered so deeply that a flood soon followed. For readers living in the Second Temple period, roughly from the 5th century before Christ to the 1st century after, this silence was unsettling. Scripture was assumed to be meaningful, not vague by accident. If a disaster as total as the flood followed this event, then the cause demanded explanation. That is where the Watcher's narrative takes shape. Texts like 1st Enoch do not replace Genesis. They expand it. They ask what Genesis leaves unanswered. Who were the sons of God? What did they do wrong? Why did their actions corrupt the earth so completely? In Enoch, the sons of God become watchers, heavenly beings tasked with oversight, who abandon their role. The Nephilim become the violent offspring of this transgression, giants whose presence accelerates chaos and bloodshed. This expansion reflects how ancient Jewish interpretation worked. Scripture was not frozen. It was explored, retold, and filled out through interpretive tradition. The Watcher's story shows how readers connected cosmic rebellion with human suffering. During the Second Temple period, Jewish communities lived under foreign empires, Persian, Greek, and later Roman. Power felt distant and often unjust. Evil seemed larger than individual choice. By placing the origin of corruption partly in the heavens, these writers gave voice to a shared anxiety. The world felt broken beyond repair. Genesis 6 provided the seed. Enoch grew the tree. This matters for historical accuracy, because it shows that the Watchers are not an ancient memory preserved unchanged from deep antiquity. They are a response to Scripture, shaped by specific historical pressures and theological needs. The narrative assumes Genesis as its foundation and builds upward. It does not borrow from Mesopotamian gods directly. It wrestles with a biblical text that raised troubling questions about divine order and human limits. The Watchers exist because Genesis 6 felt incomplete. Their story is interpretive, not primitive science. When modern claims skip this context, they miss the point. The Watchers were never meant to explain where humans came from. They were meant to explain why violence and corruption felt unstoppable. By tracing where the Watchers enter the story, we see that they arise from Scripture, not from the stars, and that their purpose is theological before it is mythical, answering silence with meaning rather than mystery with speculation. Genesis chapter 6 is one of the shortest and most unsettling passages in the Hebrew Bible. In just a handful of verses, it introduces ideas that feel enormous and unresolved. It says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took wives for themselves. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward. Then it moves directly to divine regret and the decision to bring the flood. No explanation is offered. No identities are clarified. The text assumes the reader understands what is happening, yet later generations clearly did not. That tension is what lit the fire. Genesis 6 does not describe spaceships, ancient technology, or gods creating humans. It describes a boundary crossed and consequences that follow. The sons of God are mentioned without definition, but elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible the phrase often refers to heavenly beings in a divine council. The Nephilim are named but not explained, only associated with size, strength, and later memories of fear. The passage links their presence with a rise in human wickedness and violence, but it does not spell out cause and effect. For ancient readers, especially during the Second Temple period, that silence was dangerous. Scripture was believed to be purposeful. If something so catastrophic followed, the cause had to be understood. Later writers felt compelled to explain what Genesis left compressed. Why did violence suddenly dominate the earth? Why did God regret creation? Why was judgment so severe? Genesis 6 suggests that corruption was not only human. Something else went wrong first. That suggestion opened the door for interpretation. The giants mentioned later in Numbers chapter 13, where Israelite spies describe seeing Nephilim in the land, kept the mystery alive. These figures were remembered as symbols of overwhelming threat. The question became, where did such beings come from? Genesis did not answer, so interpretive texts stepped in. Books like 1st Enoch expanded Genesis 6 into a full explanation. They identified the sons of God as watchers, explained their descent, and described the birth of giants as a consequence. This was not rewriting scripture. It was an attempt to protect it from ambiguity. Violence had to have a cause. Corruption had to have a source. The Watcher's narrative gave structure to fear. It also reflected real historical pressure. Jewish communities under foreign rule experienced power as distant and destructive. Violence felt systemic, not random. Genesis 6 offered a framework where chaos entered the world through disobedience at the highest level. That made suffering intelligible. It did not remove pain, but it explained it. What Genesis 6 does not say is just as important. It does not name Anunnaki. It does not describe advanced knowledge as progress. It does not praise the sons of God. It frames the entire episode as failure. Later writers followed that lead. The Watchers were not heroes or teachers. They were offenders. Understanding Genesis 6 correctly shows why ancient authors expanded it. They were not preserving alien memory. They were defending meaning in the face of silence, turning a few unsettling lines into a moral explanation for a broken world. 1st Enoch offers the most detailed and influential version of the Watcher's story, turning the brief hints of Genesis into a structured explanation of cosmic failure. Written and compiled over time during the Second Temple period, its opening sections describe a group of heavenly beings assigned to watch the earth. These beings see humanity and desire crosses observation. According to the text, 200 watchers agree to descend together, led by figures such as Shemi-Hazza. This decision is not impulsive. They fear punishment and bind themselves with an oath to ensure no one turns back. That oath matters because it frames the event as collective rebellion, not temptation, forced upon a few. The descent is deliberate. Once on earth, the Watchers take human women as partners. 1st Enoch presents this as a violation of cosmic order. Heaven and earth had limits. Those limits are broken. The result is not harmony but imbalance. The unions produce offspring described as giants, beings of enormous size and appetite. These giants consume resources, then turn violent when scarcity follows. Violence spreads outward. Animals, humans, and the land itself suffer. The text portrays a world unraveling step by step. Alongside these unions, the Watchers teach forbidden knowledge. This is not framed as neutral skill sharing. They reveal practices the authors considered dangerous when separated from divine authority. These include weapon making, manipulation of celestial signs, sorcery, and the use of cosmetics to deceive. Each teaching is connected to social breakdown. Weapons fuel war. Sorcery distorts justice. False signs corrupt truth. Deception erodes trust. The message is consistent. Knowledge without restraint accelerates collapse. 1st Enoch then shifts from cause to response. The suffering of the earth reaches heaven. Archangels observe the destruction and appeal to God. Their plea emphasizes bloodshed and lawlessness, not technological imbalance. The divine response is judgment. The Watchers are condemned. They are bound and imprisoned until a final reckoning. Their offspring, the giants, are destroyed. Their spirits are said to become wandering forces that continue to trouble humanity, explaining ongoing evil even after the flood. This structure matters historically. First, Enoch is not recording events. It is interpreting reality through mythic language. The oath, the descent, and the bargain all serve a moral purpose. The writers were explaining why evil felt entrenched and why judgment seemed necessary. The flood becomes a response to layered corruption, not random anger. Importantly, 1st Enoch never presents the Watchers as misunderstood benefactors. Their actions are framed as betrayal. The knowledge they share is labelled forbidden because it breaks trust and order. This is why later Jewish and early Christian readers took the story seriously. It reinforced ideas about boundaries, obedience, and accountability. Understanding Enoch's version shows that the Watcher's narrative is internally coherent and ethically driven. It is not a scrambled memory of ancient visitors. It is a structured argument about how rebellion, when organized and justified, can devastate both heaven and earth together as one explanation accepted by many ancient communities for generations worldwide, historically. One of the strongest reasons the Watchers are misunderstood today is the way their knowledge is described. 1st Enoch lists specific skills the Watchers teach humanity, and modern readers often misread that list through a science fiction lens. But in the ancient world, these arts were not neutral or futuristic. They were moral flashpoints. The text names metallurgy, cosmetics, sorcery, and astrology as forbidden knowledge, not because they were advanced, but because they were seen as dangerous when misused. Metallurgy in the ancient Near East was closely tied to weapon making. Teaching humans how to shape metals was not about tools or progress. It was about swords, spears, and instruments of war. In a society where violence was already feared, this knowledge symbolized escalation. Cosmetics are mentioned not as beauty, but as deception. Ancient writers associated adornment with manipulation, the masking of truth, and the distortion of social order. Sorcery represented attempts to control reality through illicit means, bypassing divine authority. Astrology, especially the reading of signs and omens, was seen as a challenge to God's control over time and destiny. None of these arts are described with admiration. They are framed as accelerants of corruption. This is critical for historical accuracy. Ancient Jewish authors were not documenting how humans learned science. They were offering a moral diagnosis of why society felt out of control. Forbidden knowledge in 1st Enoch is not about intelligence. It is about timing, authority, and limits. Knowledge given outside proper bounds becomes destructive. This theme appears across ancient literature. In Mesopotamian myths, in Greek stories like Prometheus, and in biblical texts like the Garden of Eden, the problem is not knowing, but knowing without permission or wisdom. 1st Enoch fits squarely within this tradition. The Watchers are condemned not for teaching humans new things, but for breaking trust and order. When modern theories claim these descriptions point to advanced alien technology, they ignore how ancient audiences would have heard them. Metallurgy was already known for centuries before 1st Enoch was written. Astrology was practiced openly in Babylonian courts. Cosmetics were common. Sorcery accusations were part of everyday religious language. None of this was mysterious or futuristic. What made it forbidden was who taught it and why. The Watchers were not meant to instruct humans. Their role was observation. By teaching, they overstepped. The text uses familiar skills to make a moral point. It warns that when power and knowledge are separated from accountability, violence follows. This is why the list feels symbolic rather than technical. Each art corresponds to a form of social decay. Weapons lead to bloodshed. Deception erodes trust. Sorcery undermines justice. False signs distort truth. The writers of First Enoch were responding to a world they felt was spiraling. Empires rose and fell through force. Elites manipulated truth. Power felt untouchable. The Watcher's narrative gives that anxiety a cosmic frame. It does not preserve a record of alien teachers. It preserves a warning. When read in its historical context, the forbidden knowledge motif becomes a moral critique of unchecked power, not a hidden archive of lost science. In the Enochic worldview, the giants are not a side detail, they are the turning point. Once the Watchers cross their boundary and take human partners, the consequences move quickly from private rebellion to public disaster. The offspring of these unions are described as giants, not only in size, but in appetite and power. They consume more than the land can sustain. First, Enoch emphasizes hunger as the first stage of collapse. When resources run out, violence follows. The giants turn against humanity, then against animals, and finally against one another. Bloodshed becomes normal. This sequence explains why the world feels unlivable by the time the flood arrives. Violence is not accidental. It is the natural outcome of imbalance. Ancient readers would have recognized this logic immediately. Large-scale violence was a familiar reality in a world dominated by empires and warfare. The giants function as an exaggerated symbol of unchecked power. They take without restraint and destroy without consequence. In this framework, the Watchers are not the final problem. They are the trigger. The giants are the multiplier. Their existence turns moral failure into environmental and social collapse. First Enoch describes the earth itself crying out because of bloodshed. This is important. The flood is not framed as sudden anger. It is framed as response. Heaven reacts to sustained injustice. The archangels observe the destruction and report it. Their complaint is specific. Humanity is being wiped out by forces beyond control. Law has collapsed. Life cannot continue as it is. The flood becomes an act of containment. In this logic, the flood is cosmic justice, not vengeance. It resets what cannot be repaired. This interpretation helps explain why ancient writers felt the flood needed such a severe cause. A few bad humans would not justify global destruction. A cosmic rebellion that unleashed uncontrollable violence might. The giants also explain lingering evil after the flood. First, Enoch claims that while their bodies are destroyed, their spirits remain, becoming forces that continue to afflict humanity. This detail shows how ancient thinkers accounted for ongoing violence in a world that was supposedly cleansed. Evil did not disappear, it changed form. This mattered deeply to Second Temple readers who still experienced oppression and bloodshed centuries after the flood story. The logic held together. The Watchers caused the fall. The giants spread the damage. The flood stopped the worst of it. What remained required ongoing restraint and law. When modern interpretations turn giants into misunderstood hybrids or heroic beings, they invert the original meaning. In Enoch, they are not admired. They are feared. They represent what happens when power grows faster than responsibility. This is why the flood follows inevitably. It is not punishment for curiosity. It is intervention against annihilation. The narrative reflects ancient moral reasoning. When violence becomes total, preservation requires drastic action. Understanding this chain reaction shows that the Watcher's story was built to explain justice, not mystery. It answers why destruction came and why it felt necessary. The flood is the conclusion of a process, not a random reset. In the Enochic imagination, justice arrives only after every other boundary has already been broken completely. When people today hear the word angel, they imagine a fixed category, winged messengers with a clear job description. That image did not exist when the Watchers' texts were written. In the ancient world, angel language was fluid and still developing. The Watchers sit inside that process, not at the end of it. In early Hebrew texts, heavenly beings appear under many titles: sons of God, holy ones, messengers, watchers, spirits. These terms overlap but are not identical. They describe function more than identity. A being could observe, deliver a message, or execute judgment depending on context. During the Second Temple period, this flexible system began to organize into hierarchies. Writers tried to map the unseen world with structure and order. The Watchers belong to this moment of transition. They are not yet angels in the later Christian sense, but they are not gods either. They are overseers, assigned roles within a larger divine administration. First Enoch shows this clearly. The Watchers answer to higher beings. Archangels like Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel appear as enforcers of divine will. This distinction matters. It shows that the Watchers are subordinate. Their rebellion is serious precisely because they were not supreme. They abused delegated authority. Over time, Jewish thought continued to refine these categories. By the 1st century after Christ, angels were more clearly defined as messengers loyal to God, while fallen beings were grouped as demons or evil spirits. The Watcher's narrative fed into that development. It helped explain how a heavenly being could fall without threatening monotheism. Evil did not come from a rival god. It came from disobedience within the system. This evolution also explains confusion in later readings. When people ask whether Watchers are angels, the honest answer is both yes and no. They are angels in the sense that they are heavenly servants. They are not angels in the sense later traditions imagine. The category was still under construction. Understanding this prevents anachronism. We cannot project medieval or modern angelology backward onto Second Temple texts. Doing so distorts the Watchers into something they were never meant to be. The Watchers function as a warning within a moral universe. Their fall demonstrates that status does not protect against judgment. Oversight without obedience becomes corruption. This is why the story mattered so much to ancient readers. It reinforced accountability at every level of existence. Kings, priests, humans, and heavenly beings were all subject to law. No one was exempt. When modern theories detach the Watchers from this framework and recast them as aliens or independent powers, they erase the very logic that gives the story meaning. The Watchers only make sense inside a developing theology of order and rebellion. They are part of a living tradition, one that was actively shaping how people understood heaven, authority, and evil. They are not a fixed species mislabeled by time. They are a snapshot of belief in motion, captured during a period when the unseen world was being mapped with urgency together. The world that produced the Enochic writings was not calm or secure. It was shaped by conquest, displacement, and constant pressure from foreign powers. From the 6th century before Christ onward, Jewish communities lived under a sequence of empires that ruled their land and influenced their daily lives. First came the Babylonians, whose destruction of Jerusalem and exile of elites shattered older assumptions about divine protection. Then came the Persians, who allowed return and rebuilding but kept firm control. After that, the Greek empires arrived, first under Alexander and then under competing dynasties that pushed language, customs, and religion into Jewish society. By the time Enochic literature was circulating widely, many Jews lived under Greek rule, later replaced by Roman authority. Power felt distant and overwhelming. Decisions were made far away, Armies enforced order. Local traditions felt fragile. This environment sharpened questions about evil and justice. Why did the righteous suffer while violent empires thrived? Why did foreign kings rule land promised by God? The Enochic worldview responds to this anxiety by expanding the scale of the problem. Evil is not just human failure, it has cosmic roots. The Watcher's narrative reflects a sense that corruption runs deeper than bad leadership or poor choices. It imagines that rebellion began above, then flowed downward into history. This made suffering intelligible without abandoning faith. The problem was not that God was weak, the problem was that order itself had been violated. Cultural pressure also played a role. Greek culture brought new philosophies, sciences, and religious ideas. Some Jews embraced them, others feared assimilation. Questions of purity, law, and identity became urgent. Who were we allowed to become? What knowledge was safe? What boundaries could not be crossed? The forbidden knowledge motif in Enoch mirrors these concerns. It frames certain kinds of learning as dangerous when detached from covenant and restraint. The Watchers become a warning about adopting power without loyalty. Exile and foreign rule also changed how history was read. Earlier biblical texts often explained disaster as punishment for human sin. That explanation felt incomplete when faithful communities still suffered. Enochic literature offers a broader frame. It suggests that history is influenced by forces beyond human control, but not beyond judgment. Evil may be powerful, but it is temporary. The Watchers abound. The giants are destroyed. Justice is delayed, not denied. This message mattered deeply to people living under empires. It offered hope without denying reality. The world was broken, but not abandoned. Understanding this context helps explain why the Watcher's story resonated. It was not abstract speculation. It was a response to lived experience. Violence, domination, and cultural erosion felt constant. By projecting these pressures into a cosmic drama, Enochic writers made sense of fear without surrendering belief. They preserved identity by explaining suffering. The Watcher's narrative is inseparable from this world. It is shaped by empire, exile, and anxiety. Remove that context, and the story loses its purpose. It was never meant to explain strange beings from the sky. It was meant to help people endure a world where power seemed unjust and purity felt under threat every day. To understand whether the Watchers could be a rebranded version of the Anunnaki must be allowed to exist in their own historical world first. The Anunnaki are not a single race, not visitors from space, and not a unified group with one fixed story. They are a category of gods that appear across Sumerian and Akkadian texts written over more than 1,000 years. The earliest references appear in Sumerian sources from the 3rd millennium before Christ, long before the Jewish texts that mention the Watchers. The word Anunnaki likely means offspring of An, or princely seed, tying them to divine authority rather than physical origin. In early myths, the Anunnaki are part of a divine assembly. They are high-ranking gods who help govern the cosmos. Their roles change depending on the city, the era, and the story being told. In some texts, they are judges. In others, they are associated with the underworld. In still others, they appear as advisors or witnesses to major divine decisions. This flexibility is normal in ancient Mesopotamian religion. There was no single canon. Each city honored its own gods and emphasized different traditions. Importantly, the Anunnaki are never portrayed as outsiders to the divine order. They are insiders. They do not rebel against the cosmic system, they help enforce it. When humans are created in Mesopotamian myth, it is often to relieve lesser gods from labor, not to advance civilization. Knowledge flows from gods to humans openly through temples, priests, and kings. There is no sense of forbidden teaching in the way 1st Enoch describes. Metallurgy, agriculture, writing, and astronomy are gifts of the gods, celebrated as signs of divine favor. This difference matters. The Anunnaki are not punished for sharing knowledge. They are honored for maintaining order. Their world assumes many gods with competing interests, but rebellion is not framed as moral catastrophe. It is part of divine politics. Over centuries, Mesopotamian religion evolved. The prominence of certain gods rose and fell. The Anunnaki sometimes faded into the background as other deities like Marduk took center stage. This shows that Anunnaki is not a stable identity. It is a label used within a living religious system. Modern claims that flatten this complexity into a single alien race to ignore the evidence. Ancient scribes were not describing visitors. They were recording theology, ritual, and kingship. The Anunnaki belong to a polytheistic worldview where divine beings are tied to land, city, and order. They do not descend secretly. They do not violate boundaries. They do not produce hybrid monsters that destroy the earth. When read on their own terms, the Anunnaki are clearly gods of Mesopotamia, not hidden versions of the Watchers. Treating them as such replaces history with imagination and context, understood clearly today by scholars who read cuneiform tablets rather than modern summaries, and who track how myths shift across centuries and regions with care, restraint consistently applied academically across ancient Near Eastern studies worldwide, today, fully accepted now. One of the biggest mistakes in modern comparisons is treating Sumer as if it were a single story with a single belief system. It was not. Mesopotamian religion developed over thousands of years across many cities, languages, and political changes. What people believed in Ur around the 3rd millennium before Christ was not identical to what people believed in Babylon 1,000 years later. Gods shifted roles. Names changed importance. Local traditions shaped theology. This makes any one-to-one mapping between Mesopotamian gods and later figures deeply unreliable. Each city-state had its own patron deity. Ur honored Nana. Uruk elevated Inanna. Babylon centered on Marduk. As political power moved, religious emphasis moved with it. Older gods were absorbed, redefined, or demoted. The Anunnaki appeared differently, depending on when and where a text was written. In some periods, they are sky gods. In others, they are judges of the underworld. Sometimes they are central, sometimes they barely appear. This fluidity is not confusion. It is how ancient polytheistic systems worked. Religion followed politics, land, and identity. There was no central authority enforcing one correct version. Scribes wrote for their city, their temple, and their king. This matters because modern claims often quote a single line from a single tablet and treat it as universal truth. That is not how Mesopotamian sources function. Even the language shifts. Early Sumerian texts are written in a different tongue than later Akkadian ones. Words are reused, translated, and reinterpreted. A title in one era can become a proper name in another. This makes direct comparison with Jewish texts even more difficult. Jewish literature, especially during the Second Temple period, moved toward a more unified theological framework centered on one God. Mesopotamian religion never made that move. Its gods were many, overlapping, and sometimes contradictory. Trying to match Watchers to Anunnaki assumes stable identities that did not exist. It also ignores purpose. Mesopotamian myths explained kingship, labor, and divine favor. Enochic literature explained evil, judgment, and suffering. These are different questions producing different answers. Similar imagery does not mean shared identity. A divine counsel in one culture does not equal a divine rebellion in another. When modern theories collapse centuries of variation into a single storyline, they erase what makes ancient religion meaningful. Complexity is not a flaw, it is the evidence. The more closely scholars read the tablets, the more diversity they find. That diversity makes simple rebranding impossible. Sumer is not one story. It is many stories layered over time. Treating it as a single source for later myths flattens history into fiction. Respecting change across eras is the only way to understand what ancient people actually believed, and why attempts to force alignment across cultures usually reveal modern expectations rather than ancient realities grounded in specific places, traditions, and historical moments experienced by real communities over time, continuously evolving across generations, shaped by conquest, trade, language, change, and shifting political authority throughout Mesopotamian history itself, alone proves this clearly today globally. When the Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian texts, they are doing very specific jobs within a well-understood religious system. They are not mysterious figures whose purpose is hidden or unclear. In the earliest Sumerian and later Akkadian sources, the Anunnaki function as members of the Divine Assembly, a council of gods responsible for maintaining cosmic order. This idea of a divine council was common across the ancient Near East. Gods met, debated, issued decrees, and confirmed authority. The Anunnaki often appear in these settings as senior figures associated with legitimacy, judgment, and the structure of the universe. They are not explorers. They are administrators of a divine state. In several myths, the Anunnaki are involved in deciding fates, confirming kingship, or witnessing major cosmic events. Their authority flows downward, not outward. Another important role tied to the Anunnaki is their connection to the underworld in certain periods. In some Akkadian texts, the Anunnaki are described as judges of the dead, presiding over the realm below the earth. This does not mean they rule it alone, but that they participate in its order. This association develops over time and does not replace their earlier functions. It shows how flexible divine roles were in Mesopotamian religion. A god could be celestial in one text and chthonic in another without contradiction. This flexibility is key to understanding what the Anunnaki actually do. They enforce order wherever order is needed. They are not portrayed as breaking rules or rebelling against higher authority. They are part of the mechanism that keeps the cosmos stable. Knowledge in Mesopotamian myth is also handled very differently than in Enochic literature. When humans receive skills like writing, farming, or astronomy, these are gifts sanctioned by the gods. Temples teach them. Kings receive them through divine favor. There is no sense that knowledge itself is corrupting or forbidden. The Anunnaki do not secretly teach humans dangerous arts. They authorize civilization. This difference matters because it shows how incompatible the Anunnaki are with the Watcher's narrative. The Watchers are condemned for teaching without permission. The Anunnaki are respected for maintaining structure. Even when Mesopotamian myths describe conflict among gods, those conflicts are political, not moral in the Enochic sense. Gods compete for status or control, but the universe is never portrayed as collapsing because of forbidden teaching. Order bends but does not break. Over time, as empires rose and fell, the prominence of the Anunnaki shifted. Gods like Marduk absorbed many of their functions, especially in Babylonian theology. This does not erase the Anunnaki. It shows how religious systems evolve. Their fading prominence is evidence of historical development, not hidden suppression. Modern alien interpretations reverse this pattern. They strip away context and reframe divine administration as extraterrestrial oversight. That move solves no historical problem. It creates one. When the Anunnaki are read as they appear in the texts, they fit perfectly into Mesopotamian religion and nowhere else. They are gods among gods, not visitors among humans. Understanding what the Anunnaki actually do makes it clear that their roles, motivations, and narrative function have nothing in common with the Watchers beyond surface imagery. Similar words like heaven or descent do not create identity. Function and purpose do. In that test, the Anunnaki remain firmly grounded in their own world and their own meaning forever. Much of the confusion surrounding the Anunnaki comes from the blending of their identity with another group of divine beings known as the Igigi. In Mesopotamian texts, the Igigi and the Anunnaki are not the same, but later retellings often merge them into a single group. The Igigi appear most clearly in Akkadian myths as lower-tier gods who perform labor on behalf of higher deities. In some stories, they are responsible for maintaining canals, agriculture, and the physical work needed to keep the world functioning. Over time, these laboring gods grow exhausted and rebel, refusing to continue their work. This moment is crucial because it leads to the creation of humanity. Humans are made to take over the work the Igigi no longer want to do. This myth explains why humans labor and why gods rule. It is about social order, not cosmic corruption. The Anunnaki in these same stories occupy a different position. They are senior gods who oversee decisions and maintain authority. When modern interpretations collapse the Igigi and the Anunnaki into one group, they unintentionally rewrite the story. The rebellion of the Igigi becomes misattributed to the Anunnaki, and suddenly the Anunnaki are portrayed as rebels, workers, or punished beings. That is not how the original texts present them. This confusion grows when people search for parallels with the Watchers. A group of divine beings rebels. Humans are created or affected. Labor and knowledge are involved. On the surface, it feels similar, but the meaning is entirely different. In the Igigi myth, rebellion is resolved through negotiation and creation, not punishment. The gods respond pragmatically. Humanity is introduced as a solution. There is no flood. There is no moral condemnation. There is no claim that knowledge itself is forbidden. Labor is the problem, not corruption. This distinction matters. When ancient texts are read carefully, the roles are clear. The Igigi rebel because they are overworked. The Watchers rebel because they abandon their assigned role and violate boundaries. The Anunnaki do not rebel at all. They remain part of the governing structure. Modern confusion also comes from translation shortcuts. Popular summaries often use Anunnaki as a catch-all term for Mesopotamian gods. This flattens complexity and makes it easier to draw dramatic connections. Once that happens, the labor revolt of the Igigi gets folded into Anunnaki mythology and from there into alien narratives. The result feels cohesive but is historically false. Ancient Mesopotamian religion did not operate with clean categories or single villains. It worked through layered roles and evolving myths. When we separate the Igigi from the Anunnaki, much of the mystery disappears. The labor myth explains human toil. The Anunnaki explain divine authority. Neither explains cosmic moral collapse. That role belongs to the Watchers in Jewish literature. Understanding this distinction shows why claims of rebranding fail. They rely on mixing characters from different systems and assigning them new motives. The ancient texts themselves do not support that move. They describe different problems and offer different explanations. Confusion thrives where context is ignored. Clarity returns when each group is allowed to speak in its own voice within its own world. When claims are made that the Watchers are simply the Anunnaki under a different name, the strongest test is narrative structure. Stories reveal identity through how events unfold, not just through shared imagery. When the Watcher's story from First Enoch is placed beside Mesopotamian myths, the differences quickly outweigh the similarities. The Watcher's narrative follows a clear sequence. Heavenly beings are assigned a role. They abandon that role by choice. They descend without permission. They take human partners. They teach forbidden practices. Their actions produce violent offspring. Society collapses. Divine judgment follows. Punishment is permanent. This chain is moral from start to finish. Every step reinforces the idea of transgression and accountability. Mesopotamian myths do not follow this pattern. When gods descend or interact with humans, it is usually authorized. Creation stories like the Atrahasis epic describe gods making humans to solve a labor problem, not as a result of forbidden unions. There is no oath of rebellion. There is no condemnation of teaching. Knowledge is transmitted openly through temples and kings. When conflict occurs among gods, it is political, not ethical. The universe is not portrayed as corrupted by that conflict. It is adjusted. Even flood stories differ in structure. Mesopotamian floods are responses to human noise or overpopulation, not to cosmic moral collapse caused by divine rebellion. The gods regret practical inconvenience, not injustice. This matters because modern parallels often rely on surface similarities. Both traditions mention gods, floods, and divine councils. But those elements are common across ancient cultures. What matters is how they are used. In Enoch, the flood is a moral necessity. In Mesopotamian myth, it is a management decision. The Watchers are punished eternally. Mesopotamian gods are rarely punished at all. There is also no equivalent to the giant offspring in Mesopotamian texts. While heroes of great size exist, they are not framed as monsters born from illicit unions that destroy the world. They are often celebrated. The absence of this key element weakens any direct comparison. The Watcher's story hinges on boundary violation between heaven and earth. Mesopotamian religion does not emphasize that boundary in the same way. Gods walk among humans regularly. Temples exist as meeting points. There is no sharp line that must not be crossed. Without that line, the core tension of the Watcher's narrative disappears. Even the concept of forbidden knowledge fails to align. Mesopotamian texts praise divine instruction. Enoch condemns it when misused. These are opposing moral frameworks. Similar words like dissent or teaching do not create equivalence. They serve different functions. When narrative structures are compared honestly, the parallels become thin. Where similarities exist, they are broad cultural themes, not shared plots. Divine councils, floods, and cosmic order appear everywhere because ancient people looked at the same sky and faced similar fears. That does not mean they told the same story. Identity requires consistent roles, motivations, and outcomes. On that test, the Watchers and Mesopotamian gods diverge sharply. The Watcher's story is about moral collapse from disobedience. Mesopotamian myths are about maintaining balance through hierarchy. One explains evil, the other explains order. When structure is respected, the idea of direct rebranding loses support. The stories are not variants of one myth. They are answers to different questions shaped by different worlds entirely. When ancient texts from different cultures sound similar, it is tempting to assume they are talking about the same beings. Words like heaven, descent, watchers, gods, or divine assembly appear across the ancient world. But shared language does not equal shared identity. Ancient peoples lived under the same sky. They watched the same sun, moon, and stars. They faced the same fears about storms, war, death, and injustice. It is natural that their religious language overlaps. What matters is how that language is used. In Jewish texts like 1st Enoch, sky language is moral. Heaven is a place of order. Earth is a place of testing. When beings cross between them, boundaries are violated. In Mesopotamian religion, sky language is administrative. Gods move freely because heaven and earth are parts of the same system. There is no sharp moral boundary being crossed. The same word can carry very different meaning. This is where modern comparisons often fail. They treat imagery as evidence instead of function. A divine council appears in both traditions, but the council does different work. In Mesopotamia, it confirms kingship and distributes authority. In Jewish literature, it enforces law and judges rebellion. Dissent also means different things. For the Watchers, dissent is a crime. For Mesopotamian gods, dissent is routine. Even the idea of watchers is not unique. Many cultures imagine divine beings who observe human affairs. Observation is a universal religious idea, not a signature of one group. Identity is revealed through motivation and outcome. The Watchers descend because of desire and defiance. The Anunnaki do not descend in secret or rebellion. They rule openly. Outcomes also differ. The Watchers are imprisoned and erased from authority. Mesopotamian gods retain power even when they disagree. There is no lasting punishment that removes them from the system. Shared imagery also comes from shared geography. Jewish communities lived near Mesopotamian cultures for centuries. They borrowed words, metaphors, and symbols, but they reworked them to fit monotheism. Borrowing language is not borrowing characters. The Hebrew Bible itself borrows imagery from older cultures while reshaping meaning. Chaos, monsters, floods, and divine courts are familiar across the region. Israelite writers used those images to argue something new, that one God rules all and that moral law governs even the heavens. When modern theories claim shared imagery proves shared beings, they reverse how influence works. Ideas travel, names change, meaning shifts. Ancient authors were not copying identities. They were repurposing symbols. This is why historians focus on context instead of coincidence. Similar phrases can hide opposite ideas. The Watchers exist to explain why evil feels cosmic. The Anunnaki exist to explain how order is maintained. One is a warning, the other is a structure. The sky belongs to everyone, but stories written beneath it are shaped by different histories. Seeing the same stars does not mean telling the same story. When identity is tested through role, purpose, and moral logic, shared language collapses into coincidence. Similar imagery invites comparison, but it does not prove equivalence. Understanding that difference protects history from becoming a collage of assumptions rather than a record of real belief. Second Temple Jews did not live in isolation, and they were not ignorant of the cultures that surrounded them. From the 6th century before Christ onward, Jewish communities lived inside empires that stretched across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Exile in Babylon placed Judeans directly inside a Mesopotamian world of language, administration, and religion. Even after many returned to Judah under Persian rule, large communities remained in Mesopotamian cities for generations. Trade routes, imperial bureaucracy, and shared languages like Aramaic ensured ongoing contact. This makes influence possible and even likely. But influence does not mean identity. Jewish writers were aware of Mesopotamian myths, symbols, and ideas, yet they filtered everything through a radically different worldview. By the Second Temple period, Jewish theology was firmly monotheistic. There was one God, not many. Divine beings existed, but they were created, subordinate, and accountable. This framework reshaped any borrowed imagery. Flood stories offer a clear example. Mesopotamian versions like the Epic of Gilgamesh were known in the region long before Jewish texts were written. Jewish authors did not deny the story, they reframed it. The flood became a moral response to corruption, not an emotional reaction by competing gods. The same process appears in the Watchers tradition. Jewish writers were familiar with the idea of divine councils and heavenly beings. Those concepts already existed in Mesopotamian religion. What they did differently was attach moral law to them. In Enochic literature, heavenly beings can sin, they can be judged. That idea does not exist in Mesopotamian theology in the same way. This shows creative adaptation, not copying. Second Temple Jews also encountered Greek culture after the conquests of Alexander. Greek philosophy, astronomy, and mythology entered Jewish discourse. Yet again, ideas were absorbed selectively. Jewish texts argue against astrology even while acknowledging the heavens. They criticize foreign wisdom while explaining why it is tempting. Awareness does not equal acceptance. It means engagement. Language also played a role. Aramaic became a shared imperial language across Mesopotamia and the Levant. This allowed stories and terms to circulate. But shared language does not erase boundaries. Jewish writers used familiar words to communicate unfamiliar ideas. They redefined terms within their covenant framework. When modern readers claim Jewish texts secretly preserved Mesopotamian gods under new names, they misunderstand this process. Ancient authors were not hiding identities, they were asserting difference. The Watchers are not Mesopotamian gods renamed. They are a Jewish answer to a Jewish problem, why evil felt larger than human failure alone. Influence explains shared imagery. Theology explains divergence. Second Temple Jews lived in a world full of competing stories. They chose which ones to transform and which ones to reject. That choice is visible on the page. It is why Watchers are judged and Anunnaki are not. Understanding what Jews likely knew about Mesopotamia helps clarify the boundary between borrowing language and borrowing belief. A boundary that remains clear when the texts are read with care and restraint, consistently maintained historically throughout scholarship today worldwide. Now, ideas in the ancient world did not move like files being copied from one culture to another. They traveled slowly, shaped by language, power, and belief. When motifs moved from Mesopotamia into biblical literature, they were not preserved intact, they were transformed. Mesopotamian cultures developed stories to explain kingship, labor, and cosmic balance in a world governed by many gods. When Jewish writers encountered these ideas, especially during exile and imperial rule, they did not adopt them wholesale. They filtered them through a theology centered on one sovereign God. This process can be seen across the Hebrew Bible. The image of a divine council appears in Mesopotamian texts as a gathering of gods who debate and decide. In biblical literature, a similar image appears. but its meaning changes. The council becomes a place where God reigns and lesser beings serve. Authority is not negotiated, it is enforced. Chaos monsters like Leviathan resemble earlier Near Eastern figures. Yet, in the Bible, they are not rivals. They are creatures under control. The flood motif follows the same pattern. In Mesopotamian myth, floods happen because humans are too noisy or numerous. In the Bible, the flood happens because violence and corruption dominate the earth. The event remains, but the cause shifts from inconvenience to moral failure. This is how ideas travel. Structure stays familiar, meaning changes. The Watcher's narrative follows this pattern exactly. The idea of heavenly beings observing the world was common. Jewish writers reshaped it into a story about responsibility and rebellion. The descent of divine beings becomes a crime, not a routine act. Teaching knowledge becomes forbidden when it breaks covenant. Judgment becomes permanent because justice matters. This transformation reflects theological priorities, not borrowed identities. The same process happened under Greek influence. Concepts like fate, wisdom, and the movement of the heavens entered Jewish thought, but they were reframed. Fate became providence. Wisdom became obedience. The stars declared order, but did not control destiny. Each borrowed motif was bent toward monotheism and ethics. This is why tracing influence requires caution. Similar shapes do not mean shared substance. Ancient writers were not careless borrowers. They were editors with purpose. They selected what could serve their message and rejected what could not. When modern readers claim that biblical figures are simply renamed Mesopotamian gods, they ignore this process. Names do not migrate unchanged across hostile theological boundaries. Meaning does. The Watchers are meaningful because they answer a question Mesopotamian myths were not asking. Why does evil feel systemic? Why does justice seem delayed? Why does power corrupt even those meant to protect? Those questions arise in a world shaped by empire and exile. Mesopotamian religion offered order through hierarchy. Jewish literature demanded righteousness through obedience. When motifs moved between those systems, they were repurposed to serve new goals. Understanding how ideas travel shows why surface similarity is misleading. Transformation is the evidence. The Watchers are a product of a different system, using familiar tools to express truth today clearly. Language is one of the easiest places for misunderstanding to begin. Ancient texts move through multiple languages before they reach modern readers, and every step introduces risk. A word that begins as a description can slowly harden into a creature. A title can become a name, a role can turn into an identity. This is what happens when translation traps are ignored. The Watchers are a clear example. In the earliest layers, the word refers to a function, those who watch. It describes what certain heavenly beings do, not what they are as a species. Over time, as texts move from Aramaic into Hebrew, then into Greek, and much later into modern languages, that function begins to look like a proper noun. Watcher becomes watchers. A job becomes a group. The same process occurs in Mesopotamian material. Words like Anunnaki are titles connected to authority and lineage, not biological categories. When those words are lifted out of their original grammar and context, they begin to look like labels for a race. This is how false equivalence forms. Translation also smooths over differences that mattered to ancient writers. Hebrew and Aramaic words often carry legal or moral weight that does not survive cleanly in Greek. Greek terms then pass into Latin and later modern languages, each step flattening nuance. A word meaning transgression can become rebellion. A phrase meaning boundary violation can become dissent. These shifts seem small, but they reshape meaning. By the time a modern reader encounters the text, the language feels concrete, even literal. That concreteness is an illusion. Ancient audiences understood flexibility. They knew words carried layers. Modern readers often assume precision where none existed. Another trap comes from treating translated terms as interchangeable across cultures. When a Mesopotamian text uses a word for God and a Jewish text uses a word for heavenly being, translators may choose similar English terms. That does not mean the concepts align. English becomes the bottleneck where differences disappear. This is dangerous because it invites comparison where none was intended. It becomes easy to say these must be the same beings because the words look similar on the page. In reality, the similarity is created by translation choice, not by ancient belief. Names also suffer in translation. Titles that were descriptive in one language become fixed names in another. Over centuries, readers forget the original function and treat the term as a personal identifier. This is how Watchers turn into a defined class, and Anunnaki turn into a unified group. The ancient texts resist that clarity. They assume readers know the system. Modern readers do not. This gap encourages oversimplification. Translation traps matter because they create confidence without foundation. Once a word becomes a creature, theories build quickly. Connections feel obvious. The original uncertainty is forgotten. Careful scholarship moves in the opposite direction. It asks what the word meant at the time it was written, how it functioned in a sentence, and what assumptions the original audience brought with it. When that work is done, many supposed links dissolve. The Watchers remain a role defined by failure. The Anunnaki remain a title tied to authority. Language did not preserve a hidden identity. It slowly transformed meaning through repetition and misunderstanding. Recognizing these traps restores distance between texts and protects history from being reshaped by the limits of translation alone. The idea that the Anunnaki were aliens does not come from ancient texts. It comes from the 20th century, shaped by modern interests, new technologies, and a growing fascination with space. The roots of this theory can be traced to a period after the Second World War, when rockets, satellites, and science fiction entered popular culture. As humans began to imagine leaving Earth, it became easier to imagine that others had arrived before us. Ancient texts became raw material for speculation. In the 1960s and 1970s, several writers began reinterpreting Mesopotamian myths through this lens. The most influential was Zecharia Sitchin, who argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a distant planet. He claimed they came to Earth to mine resources and genetically engineered humans as workers. These ideas were presented as translations, but they did not match accepted readings of cuneiform tablets. Linguists and Assyriologists quickly pointed out errors, invented meanings, and unsupported leaps. Despite this, the theory spread widely because it offered a dramatic alternative to traditional religion. It replaced gods with engineers and myth with technology. At the same time, distrust of institutions was rising. People questioned governments, churches, and academic authority. Alternative histories flourished in this environment. The Anunnaki theory fit perfectly. It promised hidden truth suppressed by experts. It framed believers as independent thinkers. Over time, this narrative expanded. Television shows, documentaries, and internet forums repeated the claims without checking sources. Ancient astronaut ideas blended with conspiracy culture. The Watchers from Jewish texts were folded in as another example of the same supposed visitors. Similar words like descent and teaching were treated as evidence. Differences in purpose, theology, and outcome were ignored. What mattered was coherence within the modern story, not accuracy to the ancient one. This version of the Anunnaki also reflects modern values. It assumes advanced technology explains everything. It prefers material causes over moral ones. It recasts ancient anxiety about power and justice as misunderstood science. That makes the past feel familiar and controllable. But familiarity is not evidence. No ancient Mesopotamian text describes spacecraft, planets beyond the visible heavens, or genetic engineering. These ideas are read into the texts, not found in them. When scholars return to the tablets themselves, the alien theory collapses. The Anunnaki remain gods within a religious system, not visitors from the stars. Understanding where this theory comes from helps explain why it feels convincing to some. It speaks the language of the modern world, not the ancient one. It reflects fears and hopes shaped by the space age, not by temple worship or empire. The Anunnaki equals aliens idea tells us far more about the 20th century than about Sumer or Babylon. Recognizing the origin allows the ancient texts to be read on their own terms again, without the weight of modern speculation reshaping their meaning. In modern paranormal culture, the Watchers are no longer treated as moral beings within a theological system. They are recast as technological actors in a science fiction narrative. This shift begins when ancient explanations of evil feel unsatisfying to modern audiences. Moral failure sounds abstract. Technology feels concrete. As a result, theology is replaced with machinery. The Watchers become astronauts. Their descent becomes a landing. Their teaching becomes advanced science. Judgment becomes a cover-up. This transformation accelerates in the late 20th century as ancient astronaut theories merge with paranormal media. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and online videos repeat the same pattern. Religious language is stripped away and replaced with modern assumptions about intelligence and progress. The Watchers are no longer condemned for disobedience. They are admired for innovation. What was once a warning becomes a boast. This reinterpretation depends on selective reading. Passages about forbidden knowledge are reframed as misunderstood science. Giants become genetic experiments. Heavenly realms become planets. None of this comes from the original texts. It comes from modern imagination filling gaps with familiar concepts. Paranormal culture favors explanations that remove accountability. If evil is caused by outside visitors, then humanity is a victim, not a participant. This is a powerful idea. It shifts responsibility away from moral choice and toward cosmic interference. That appeal explains why the Watchers are attractive figures in modern retellings. They turn ancient anxiety into external threat. They also flatten theology into spectacle. In First Enoch, the Watchers are terrifying because they fail. In modern culture, they are fascinating because they succeed. This reversal is complete. The original authors warned against boundary crossing. Modern retellings celebrate it. Technology replaces covenant. Power replaces obedience. Mystery replaces meaning. The process is gradual. A single speculative book becomes a reference. A reference becomes a genre. A genre becomes assumed background knowledge. Eventually, people encounter the Watchers first through paranormal content, not through ancient texts. By the time they reach Enoch or Genesis, their expectations are already set. They read the text through a modern filter. That filter rewards novelty and ignores context. This is not accidental. Paranormal culture thrives on unresolved questions. Ancient theology resolves too much. It assigns blame. It explains judgment. Technology-based stories keep the mystery open. They promise future revelation. This makes them endlessly adaptable. Each new discovery can be folded into the narrative. The watchers can always return. The cost of this adaptation is accuracy. The watchers lose their original role. They no longer explain why evil spreads through misuse of authority. They become props in a cosmic drama shaped by modern fears of surveillance, experimentation, and control. This says more about the present than the past. When theology is replaced with technology, the ancient message disappears. What remains is a mirror reflecting modern unease. Understanding this shift helps recover the original purpose of the Watcher's story. It was never about visitors. It was about responsibility. Paranormal culture rewrites that lesson because responsibility is harder to sell than mystery. If the Watchers and the Anunnaki were truly the same beings under different names, history would require a specific kind of evidence, not impressions, not similarities in imagery. Identity claims demand continuity. The first requirement would be clear textual overlap. We would need ancient sources that explicitly connect the two groups, either by shared names, shared roles, or direct acknowledgement that one tradition is referring to the other. No such text exists. Jewish writings never name the Anunnaki. Mesopotamian texts never describe watchers who fall, sin, and are imprisoned for teaching forbidden knowledge. The silence matters. The second requirement would be consistent function. Identity is revealed by what beings do. The watchers observe, transgress, teach without permission, produce destruction, and are punished. The Anunnaki govern, judge, authorize order, and remain part of the divine system. These roles are not variations of the same job, they are opposites. One represents failure of authority, the other represents maintenance of authority. A third requirement would be shared moral logic. If the Watchers were Anunnaki in another tradition, the moral framework would align. It does not. Enochic literature is driven by ethical violation and judgment. Mesopotamian religion is driven by hierarchy, balance, and ritual obligation. The Anunnaki are not condemned for sharing knowledge. They are praised for sustaining civilization. This difference cannot be explained by translation. It reflects worldview. A fourth requirement would be historical transmission. We would need evidence that Jewish authors intentionally preserved Mesopotamian gods under new names, despite rejecting polytheism. That would require motive and explanation. Instead, Jewish texts consistently polemicize against foreign gods. They demote them, reinterpret them, or deny their power. Preserving them secretly would contradict the entire theological project of Second Temple Judaism. The fifth requirement would be archaeological or material continuity. If these were the same beings remembered across cultures, we would expect consistent iconography or ritual continuity tied to them. We do not see that. Mesopotamian temples, reliefs, and inscriptions depict gods in ways that do not map onto Jewish descriptions of watchers. Jewish communities did not build shrines to watchers or invoke them in ritual. They warned against them. When historians test identity claims, they look for convergence across multiple independent lines of evidence. Names, roles, morality, transmission, and material culture must align. In this case, they do not. What we do see is shared cultural vocabulary reshaped by different systems. That is influence, not identity. Modern theories often lower the bar of proof. They treat resemblance as equivalence. They assume that if two stories mention heaven, descent, or divine beings, they must refer to the same source. History does not work that way. Many cultures independently developed similar symbols because they faced similar questions. The sky, power, injustice, and order are universal concerns. The Watcher's story answers those concerns within a Jewish moral framework. The Anunnaki myths answer them within a Mesopotamian political and ritual framework. When the evidence test is applied carefully, the claim collapses. There is no ancient assertion of identity. There is no functional match. There is no moral alignment. There is no historical pathway that preserves one group as the other. What remains is a modern desire for synthesis, not an ancient memory of sameness. History demands restraint. On that standard, the Watchers and the Anunnaki remain distinct, separate, and rooted in their own worlds entirely. There are real overlaps between the Watchers' tradition and Mesopotamian mythology, but they exist at the level of motifs, not identities. Motifs are shared patterns that appear across cultures because they address common human questions. Ancient societies looked at the same world and wrestled with similar fears. Power, justice, chaos, and order appear everywhere. It would be surprising if their stories shared nothing. The mistake comes when shared themes are treated as proof of shared beings. One clear overlap is the idea of a divine council. Both Jewish and Mesopotamian texts imagine a heavenly assembly where decisions affecting the world are made. This reflects how ancient people understood authority. Kings ruled with councils. Cities were governed by elders. The cosmos was imagined the same way. Another overlap is the belief that the heavens are not empty. Both traditions reject the idea of a distant, silent sky. The world is observed. Human actions matter. That belief produces figures who watch, judge, or administer. The overlap stops there. In Jewish literature, watching leads to accountability. In Mesopotamian religion, watching leads to administration. The motif is shared, the meaning is not. Another overlap is the use of floods to explain resets in history. Large floods were part of lived experience in the ancient Near East. Rivers overflowed. Cities were destroyed. Stories preserved memory of disaster. Both traditions use floods, but for different reasons. Mesopotamian myths frame floods as population control or divine irritation. Jewish texts frame the flood as moral judgment. The motif is water as reset. The message behind it diverges sharply. Teaching from divine beings is another shared theme. Mesopotamian gods teach humans agriculture, writing, and law. Jewish texts acknowledge divine instruction but place strict limits on it. The Watchers cross those limits. This creates a shared concern with knowledge, but opposite conclusions. One tradition celebrates it, the other warns against misuse. Even giants or heroic figures appear across cultures. Mesopotamian epics feature heroes of great strength. Biblical texts mention giants as threats. Size symbolizes power. But again, the role differs. Mesopotamian heroes often uphold order. Enochic giants destroy it. The motif of size overlaps. The function does not. These overlaps exist because ancient writers worked with a shared symbolic vocabulary shaped by geography and experience. They did not share theology. They did not share conclusions. Motifs are tools. Each culture uses them differently. Treating motifs as names collapses meaning. It assumes that because two stories use similar symbols, they must describe the same characters. That assumption ignores authorial intent. Jewish writers were not preserving Mesopotamian gods. They were redefining shared symbols to assert a different view of reality. The Watcher's story uses familiar imagery to argue something new. Power without obedience leads to ruin. Authority without restraint invites judgment. These themes mattered in a world ruled by empires. Mesopotamian myths addressed stability. Jewish texts addressed faithfulness. When overlaps are acknowledged honestly, they become evidence of dialogue, not disguise. Cultures spoke to each other through shared language, but they did not surrender their identities. Recognizing motifs without forcing names allows history to remain complex and credible. The Watchers and the Anunnaki intersect at the level of symbol, not substance. That distinction preserves what each tradition was trying to say, instead of blending them into a single story neither culture would recognize. The idea that the Watchers are simply the Anunnaki under a new name persists not because the evidence is strong, but because the story fits modern habits of thinking. One reason is cultural. Modern societies are more comfortable with technology than theology. Ancient explanations that center on sin, obedience, and judgment feel distant. Explanations that involve advanced beings, lost science, and hidden history feel familiar. They sound like progress instead of warning. Recasting ancient figures as aliens removes moral weight and replaces it with curiosity. Another reason is psychological. The rebrand offers a simple answer to complex questions. Why is the world violent? Why does power corrupt? Why does history repeat suffering? Ancient texts answer these questions by pointing to human and cosmic responsibility. That can be uncomfortable. Alien theories offer an external cause. Evil becomes interference, not failure. This shift protects modern readers from confronting difficult moral ideas. Media also plays a major role. Visual storytelling rewards spectacle. Giants, spacecraft, and secret origins are easier to sell than slow historical analysis. Television, films, and online platforms favor bold claims over careful context. Once an idea gains traction in media, repetition replaces verification. A theory heard often begins to feel true. Algorithms amplify what excites, not what is accurate. Over time, the rebrand becomes background noise, assumed rather than questioned. There is also a distrust of authority at work. Academic scholarship moves slowly and speaks cautiously. Paranormal theories move fast and speak confidently. They promise hidden knowledge uncovered by outsiders. That framing appeals to audiences who feel excluded from expertise. The Watchers as Anunnaki story thrives in this space. It positions itself as suppressed truth rather than speculative interpretation. Historical nuance struggles to compete with that energy. Another factor is the collapse of symbolic literacy. Ancient audiences understood metaphor, role, and function. Modern audiences often expect literal meaning. When ancient texts speak symbolically, modern readers assume description. A descent must be physical. A heavenly realm must be a place. A teaching must be technology. This literalism pushes ancient stories into modern categories they were never meant to occupy. The rebrand also persists because it connects multiple mysteries into one narrative. Watchers, Anunnaki, Nephilim, pyramids, and aliens become parts of a single story. This feels satisfying. It creates order out of scattered ideas. Humans are pattern-seeking. We prefer one explanation to many. Even if the explanation is flawed, its simplicity is attractive. Finally, the internet ensures longevity. Once a theory is published online, it never disappears. Corrections travel slower than claims. Videos and posts circulate without context. New audiences encounter the idea without knowing its history. Each retelling drifts further from the source. Over time, the rebrand feels older and more established than it is. Understanding why the theory persists does not require accepting it. It requires recognizing the forces that keep it alive. Cultural comfort, psychological relief, media incentives, and modern literalism all work together. The Watcher's rebrand survives because it speaks the language of the present, not because it reflects the past. History remains unchanged beneath it. The ancient texts still say what they always said. The challenge is whether modern readers are willing to listen to them on their own terms. When all the evidence is placed on the table, the conclusion becomes clear without needing extremes. The Watchers and the Anunnaki belong to related worlds, but they are not the same beings. They emerge from neighboring cultures, shared landscapes, and overlapping symbols. Yet they serve different purposes and answer different questions. The Watchers are a product of Jewish theological reflection during the Second Temple period. They exist to explain moral collapse, boundary violation, and the spread of violence beyond human choice alone. Their story is built around failure and judgment. The Anunnaki emerge from Mesopotamian religion as part of a long, evolving system of gods who maintain cosmic and political order. They are administrators, judges, and symbols of authority within a polytheistic framework. They are not condemned for their roles, they are affirmed by them. This difference is not minor, it is foundational. Related imagery does not erase divergent meaning. History shows that cultures borrow language and reshape it. They do not secretly preserve rival gods under disguise, especially when their theology openly rejects those gods. Jewish writers were not hiding Mesopotamian deities inside their texts. They were responding to empire, exile, and injustice by reframing shared symbols to defend a moral vision of the world. The Watchers are not misunderstood benefactors or ancient astronauts. They are a warning about what happens when power abandons restraint. The Anunnaki are not fallen overseers. They are gods tied to cities, temples, and kingship. Rejecting simple rebranding does not mean denying influence. Influence is real and visible. Floods, divine councils, heavenly beings, and cosmic order appear across the ancient Near East because people face the same environment and fears. What matters is how those elements are used. In Jewish texts, they are bent toward accountability. In Mesopotamian texts, they are bent toward stability. These goals do not align. Modern attempts to fuse the two flatten history into a single narrative that satisfies curiosity but ignores context. Nuance allows both traditions to remain intact. It respects that ancient people were capable of creativity, adaptation, and disagreement. It also respects that modern readers bring their own assumptions to ancient texts. The appeal of rebranding lies in simplicity. The truth is more complex and more interesting. Two cultures can speak to each other without saying the same thing. Two stories can share a sky without sharing identity. The Watchers remain a Jewish answer to the problem of evil in a world ruled by empires. The Anunnaki remain Mesopotamian gods, embedded in ritual, kingship, and order. They intersect in symbol, not substance. Holding that distinction does not weaken the past, it clarifies it. When history is read carefully, without forcing modern categories onto ancient thought, the result is not disappointment, it is depth. The verdict does not strip mystery away, it restores meaning. Related worlds do not require identical beings. They require careful listening. On that standard, the Watchers and the Anunnaki stand apart, each speaking from their own time, their own culture, and their own understanding of what went wrong and what must be preserved.